Welcome back everyone, and in this video we'll continue with the question of how does blood clot. Of course, part 2 first is what happened to my thumb, right, which I cut. But eventually the wound stopped bleeding after about an hour. It finally clotted up into a mound of red, gooey stuff. Well, of course, thankfully for me it clotted up because clotting is a very important protective function of the blood. Protective because it seals up your wounds to prevent any pathogens like bacteria or viruses from entering into your body. Okay, so we're going to talk now about how does blood clot, the mechanism, the process. So I'm going to be showing you a very simple video about clotting, and I would like you to pick up what are the main steps involved in clotting. Alright, so enjoy the video.
Usually, every time you have a cut or bruise, your blood clots to stop the bleeding. Clotting is a complex process, and there are 4 main things that make it possible. Platelets, or cell fragments. Clotting factors, which are special proteins. Fibrin, which is a protein mesh made up of a special kind of clotting factor. And finally, other cells, like red and white blood cells. Because clot formation is so important, platelets and clotting factors are always available, floating around in your blood. Now, let's talk about the 4 steps involved with forming a blood clot. When there is a tear in a blood vessel, the first thing that happens is that the nearby platelets are activated and become sticky. They start sticking to each other and to the sides of the hole in the blood vessel. For small holes, enough platelets usually stick together to form a temporary plug. But a platelet plug isn't strong enough to block the opening for long, so it must be reinforced with other materials. Otherwise, the blood flowing past the hole could wash the plug away. These other materials are called clotting factors. As the clotting factors float by the tear, they become activated or turned on and add themselves to the platelet plug. A special kind of clotting factor can weave itself together with others of the same kind and form a web of fibrous tissue called fibrin. This web acts like glue and holds the platelets and the other clotting factors together, creating a blood clot. Other cells, like red and white blood cells, can also get caught in this web and help reinforce the clot. It quickly becomes stronger and starts to pull the edges of the hole in the blood vessel together. After the clot has formed, it stays in the hole until the tissue is repaired. When the clot is no longer needed, your body dissolves it.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed the video and that you managed to pick up some of the main steps as well as the main components which are involved in clotting. And we're going to look now into more detail at each of the steps. Alright, so here are the main steps in clotting. First, of course, the blood vessel gets damaged or broken. Okay, it might be a knife cut, it might be a puncture, someone pierces something inside, but blood vessels are damaged and blood starts to flow out. And we saw in the video that the second step is that the platelets in the blood become activated, right? And they become activated, they become sticky, and they attach themselves to the broken part of the blood vessel. And they form what we call a platelet plug, right? So the platelets become activated, they stick to the damaged area and form a platelet plug. And the third main step that we saw was that the clotting factors got involved, and a very special clotting factor called fibrin formed a mesh, right, a net-like mesh, which helped to also trap blood cells, like red blood cells, to form a larger blood clot. So the fibrin threads, right, they trap blood cells to form a clot. So these are the main steps. Now let me go a bit more into detail into each of the main steps. Right, before I go further, just a little note that there will be a lot of new words coming up. Some will sound really weird, right? But I need you to try to focus and to find a way to remember them. And find a way to remember how one thing leads to another thing. And try to see how they link together to form an entire process. Okay? So with that, let's come back to the first step, where blood vessels are damaged. Now when blood vessels are damaged, the blood, the platelets actually send out a signal, a distress signal, right? The damaged vessels and platelets, they produce clotting factors. Okay, and one of the clotting factors that's produced is called thrombokinase. Thrombokinase. Now, thrombokinase does something. Thrombokinase, in the presence of calcium ions, will activate prothrombin to become thrombin. Okay, there's a protein called prothrombin in your blood, and it is activated by thrombokinase to become thrombin. Okay, it's quite easy to remember because it's like pro means before, right? So before thrombin. So prothrombin, okay, becomes thrombin. And what activates it? Thrombokinase. Okay, this word kinase is like kinetic, right? Kinetic, like moving. It activates, right? So thrombokinase activates prothrombin to become thrombin. Now, thrombin does something. Thrombin will actually help to convert fibrinogen into fibrin. Okay, so fibrinogen is another protein that's kind of always in your blood. And usually it is soluble. So it dissolves into the plasma and is just carried around. But when there is thrombin present, thrombin converts fibrinogen into fibrin. And fibrin is insoluble. So it comes out of the plasma and forms these threads. Right? So you get fibrin threads which form a net. And that net ends up trapping the blood cells to form a clot. Okay, again, the names are a bit strange, but just try to remember fibrinogen becoming fibrin. It's a bit like, remember in your digestive system, you learned about pepsinogen becoming pepsin, right? So this ogen thing kind of means like the before form, and it becomes fibrin. Okay, so let's look at that whole thing again. And I need to try to find a way to remember it. It's a process that all links together. So blood vessels are damaged. The damaged vessels produce clotting factors. The important one you need to remember is thrombokinase. Thrombokinase, right? Kinetic kinase. Thrombokinase activates prothrombin to become thrombin. Thrombin converts fibrinogen into fibrin. A fibrin thread form a net, and they trap the blood cells, like your red blood cells, to form a clot. Right? So your platelets, your blood cells, they're all involved in forming this clot. Alright, so that's all for clotting. You'll need to know this process pretty well. Sometimes they ask you to describe it, to write it out, and also to ask you about different parts of it. Now, I want to end off this video by exploring a very interesting topic, and that's the idea of an organ transplant. Yep, you got that right. Taking an organ from one person and transplanting it to another person. Now, there are problems associated with this. Because if your blood, you have white blood cells, right? If your blood protects you from foreign things like bacteria and viruses, what happens when you try to take an organ from someone else and plant it into you? A transplant. Well, we're going to see what happens. So just a piece of interesting history. The very first successful organ transplant was a kidney transplant. And it was carried out not too long ago in 1954. And this organ transplant involved a pair of twins. A brother donated his kidney to his twin brother who had failing kidneys. Talk about brotherly love there. Now, of course, that was in 1954. Fast forward to our time and age today, and we have other kinds of organ transplants, like head transplants. Oh wait, but you tell me this is probably just technology. Yes, it's just technology. Face swapping. Yeah. But do you know that, bizarre and crazy as it sounds, head transplants is no longer a thing of science fiction. No, there is a man who actually wants to go for one. And here's a short video about it. As you watch the video, think about what difficulties might occur in such a crazy procedure.
Now, doctors are apparently a step closer to performing surgery, which sounds like something from a horror novel, transplanting a human head onto another body. An Italian surgeon claims it is now possible. The first patient has been found. RT has been speaking to him.
Valery Spiridonov was born with a rare genetic muscle wasting condition. People with this illness usually don't live for more than 20 years. Not only is Valery 30 years old now, he managed to get a higher education and works as a computer scientist for an IT company. But the biggest challenge of his life is still ahead. Valeri is aiming to become the first human to undergo a body transplant surgery, attaching his head to a different body. He says his condition gets worse every year and getting a new body is the only solution, even though there's a big chance he won't survive. I'm very...
Well, I'm not quite sure how this man is at this point in time, whether the surgery was successful. Maybe if you're interested, you can go and look it up. But did you hear in the video that there was a great risk to this procedure? There's a very high chance that he might die. Of course, he's very desperate, so he just goes for this opportunity. Now, the reason why there's a high chance he might die is this thing called tissue rejection. So let's look at it in further detail. Now, tissue rejection happens when a recipient's lymphocytes or white blood cells produce antibodies to destroy a donor's transplanted organ. So for example, here's a donor and here's a recipient, right? So the donor donates his kidney to this recipient, right? The recipient has diseased kidney, so he needs a new kidney. So we take the donor's kidney and we transplant it into the recipient. However, the recipient's white blood cells recognize this transplanted kidney as foreign, right? They recognize it as foreign, and so they produce antibodies to destroy this kidney. And this kidney, this transplanted kidney, is rejected. So this tissue is rejected, and that's tissue rejection. So the recipient's immune system, the white blood cells, are just responding normally to a foreign object. But that makes such organ donations very difficult. And that's why, you know, when you always hear about transplanting kidneys and stuff, you always hear that people have to wait for the right match, right? They always have to wait for the match, and it takes very long to find someone who matches you so that there will be a smooth organ transplant. Alright, so how can we reduce the risk of tissue rejection? And this is an important question because organ transplants are so important for saving lives. How do we make successful organ transplants that do not end up with tissue rejection? Well, the first way would be to ensure that the tissues of the donor and recipient are as genetically close as possible. So we need to look for a match, right? There must be a match between the donor and the recipient. The first way is to take tissue from yourself to fix a broken part of yourself. This is what the doctors did to me once when I had a surgery to my knee. They took part of my leg muscle and they placed it into my knee. Okay, so it's my own tissue, so there's no problem with tissue rejection there. The second way is to find tissue from your close relatives. Now, your close relatives are likely to be genetically very similar, very close to you. So their tissue might match yours to a very large extent. So when we put their organs into you, the chances of tissue rejection is lower. Now, the second way to reduce the risk of tissue rejection would be to use immunosuppressive drugs. That means that I get the recipient eats a drug that suppresses his immune system, that suppresses his white blood cells, so that when the recipient receives an organ, so let's say this is the recipient, and he receives an organ from a donor, right? We put some drugs into the recipient. His white blood cells will not attack the organ, will not produce antibodies to destroy this organ. However, the problem with immunosuppressive drugs is that it causes, I'm sure you're already thinking, right, that it causes problems for the recipient. Right? He will be more prone to diseases because of these drugs. So I'm going to end off the video here. And just an interesting thing that you might want to look up. Do you know that in Singapore, is it compulsory or is it kind of opt-in or opt-out when it comes to human organ donation? Go and look it up yourself.